I want to walk you through something that's been sitting in my notebook for about a year now. I haven't moved on it because the man who told it to me asked me to wait. He had things to settle. He needed to be out of the state before any of it could go anywhere. He's settled now. He's somewhere on the Atlantic side of the country, and he didn't give me the town, and I didn't ask. So I'm going to do the next part, which is tell you what he told me. His name is Caleb Sloan. He spent 19 years as a family physician in Lynch, Kentucky. If you've never heard of Lynch, that's normal. Hardly anybody outside Harlan County has. It's a coal town in the southeastern corner of the state, sitting up against the eastern face of Black Mountain, which is the highest point in Kentucky at 4,145 feet. The town was built by United States Steel in 1917 to house miners working the Imboden seam under the mountain. By the mid-1940s, the population was close to 10,000. Today it's about 600. The high school closed in the late 70s. The company hospital is gone, leveled, just a foundation in a field now. The closest emergency room is in Harlan, about 30 minutes down US 119, when the road isn't washed out, which up there happens more than you'd think. Caleb's clinic was the only medical care in Lynch and in the hollers running up behind it. He took Medicaid and insurance and cash, and when none of those were on offer, he took what people had, which was sometimes a quarter of beef in October, or a stack of split firewood in November. Once an entire working Singer's sewing machine in better condition than anything he'd ever owned. He delivered babies, set bones, drained abscesses, sewed up coal men who got pulled into a piece of equipment that wasn't supposed to move. He buried more patients than he saved, because that's the math of the work up there. Black lung, overdose, hypertension, nobody caught in time. He told me once that if you graph the life expectancy of a man in Lynch against the same man living 2 counties west, the gap was about 11 years. That's what the holler does to you over time. He moved up there in 2005. He'd done his residency at the University of Kentucky in Lexington and could have gone almost anywhere. His wife at the time, Jenna, was the one who pushed him toward rural service. She was a public health nurse and she had a vision for it. Lynch wasn't her first pick. Pike County was. But the National Health Service Corps placed them in Harlan, and Lynch was where the open slot was, so they took it. Jenna stayed for 4 years. Then she didn't. Caleb stayed because by then the town was his patients, and you don't leave 1,600 people without a doctor because your marriage didn't work out. That's who he is. That's the part you need to understand before anything else, because the decisions he made later, the ones I'm going to tell you about, those are the decisions of a man who stays. The first year was the hardest, he told me. Not because of the medicine, though the medicine was harder than residency had prepared him for. It was the social part. Lynch in 2005 still remembered the doctor before him, a man named Hubbard who had been there for 22 years and who had died of pancreatic cancer 6 months before Caleb arrived. Caleb spent his first winter being measured against Hubbard in every way a small town measures a new arrival. Did he know the families? Did he respect the way the older people wanted to be addressed, Mr. and Mrs.? Never first names until invited. Did he understand that a house call meant a house call, not a phone consultation, even if the patient lived 12 miles up a road that wasn't paved past the Second Creek crossing? He learned. He had a good ear for it. By the end of his second year, he had been adopted, more or less, by the older women of the Pentecostal church on Stevens Street, who started bringing him casseroles on Sundays and who would, when one of their daughters or granddaughters needed something, send the patient to him with a note pinned to her coat in case she was too shy to say what was wrong. It was that kind of practice. He told me he came to understand, sometime around year 3, that being the doctor in Lynch was less like running a clinic and more like being trusted with a key to several hundred locked rooms, and that the only way to keep the key was to never use it on a room you hadn't been invited into. The Begleys, he said, were one of those rooms. He had been treating them since his second month. He had not been invited into anything that mattered until 2019. He delivered his first Begley baby in 2007, a boy named Hadley, in the front room of the same farmhouse where Senna would later be born. Hadley's mother had been a Begley cousin who'd married out and come home, and the delivery had gone normally, and Caleb had not noticed anything because in 2007 he was not yet looking. The baby had been quiet, content, the color of him good. Caleb had written him up as healthy and moved on. He looked back at Hadley's chart in 2019, after Phoebe's phone call, and saw what he had not seen at the time: the newborn vitals, the 2-week visit, the 4-month, the 6-month, the year. Everything inside the normal range, and yet everything at the same edge of the normal range. Hadley's hemoglobin at 6 months had been a 14. That's high. Not impossibly high, just high. The kind of number a doctor logs and moves past, especially in a healthy infant. Hadley by 2019 was 12 years old and living up the holler, and Caleb had been seeing him twice a year for the entire intervening time, and had logged the slow, steady climb of his blood work without ever once asking the question. Now, here's where it starts. In the spring of 2019, Caleb pulled a routine blood panel on a 14-year-old kid named Bernice Begley. The Begleys are one of the old families up the head of the holler, past Lynch, up where the gravel road turns into a logging cut, and the trees grow over the top of you so dense you don't see direct sunlight even at noon in July. Bernice came in because his mother thought he was anemic. He was pale, he was tired, he wasn't growing the way his brothers had. Caleb drew 2 purple top tubes, ran the panel through the small in-clinic analyzer he'd financed for $14,000 over 5 years, and got numbers back that he assumed were a malfunction. The hemoglobin was 21 grams per deciliter. For reference, a healthy teenage boy should be around 13 to 16. 21 is the territory of high-altitude Sherpas and elite endurance athletes after months of training above 12,000 feet. It's not the territory of a skinny kid from a holler at 2,400 feet who eats biscuits and cured pork 4 days a week. The hematocrit was 62%. Same problem, same direction. White cell count, normal. Platelets, normal. Iron stores, normal. Just the oxygen-carrying part of his blood. Off the chart in a direction that shouldn't be possible. Caleb did what any rural doctor does. He assumed the machine was off. He calibrated it, ran a control, ran a known sample. All the numbers came back exactly right. So he drew Bernice again 2 weeks later. Same result. He sent a sample down to Pikeville for lab confirmation. They sent back the same numbers and a note asking whether the patient was a competitive cyclist on EPO. Caleb laughed when he read that, because Bernice Begley had not, to his knowledge, ever been on a bicycle. Now here's the thing about practicing in a small town for a long time. You start to see patterns that nobody else would have the longitudinal data to see. Caleb pulled up Bernice's older brother, Talmadge's records. Talmadge was 19, healthy, came in twice a year for sports physicals, back when he played football for the homeschool league. Hemoglobin, 19.4. Caleb had logged it as elevated. He pulled the father, Ranson Begley. He pulled the uncle, a man named Cordy Begley, who had come in 2 years back for a cut on his hand that he'd let go 3 days too long. Hemoglobins of 18.7 and 20.1. He pulled the grandfather, Wendell Begley, who Caleb saw twice a year for blood pressure that wasn't actually all that bad considering his age, which was either 84 or 91 depending on which document you believed. Wendell's hemoglobin, taken in 2017, was 22.0. That's 6 men, 4 generations of the same family, all running blood oxygen levels that should put them in a clinic getting checked for polycythemia vera, which is a rare cancer of the bone marrow. Caleb checked the records for the rest of it. No splenomegaly, no clot history, no bone marrow symptoms. They weren't sick. They were just built different. This is the kind of thing a country doctor files in his head under interesting, and goes back to seeing the next patient on the schedule. Caleb did that. He filed it. But Bernice Begley's mother kept bringing the boy back because she was worried he wasn't thriving the way the older brothers had. And every time the kid came in, Caleb noticed something else. The teeth, for one thing. Bernice had what Caleb at first thought were retained baby canines. By 14, those should have been long gone. But on closer look, they weren't retained baby teeth. They were full adult canines that were just longer than they were supposed to be, sharper, and set slightly forward in the jaw. Caleb checked the older brother on his next visit. Same teeth, slightly less pronounced. He checked the father at his next physical. Same teeth. Filed down, smoothed by years of use, but unmistakably the same architecture. He started noticing eyes. Begley eyes were a specific color, not just a family resemblance kind of similar, the same. A pale amber, almost yellow under the fluorescent lights of the exam room, with a vertical compression to the pupil that you'd write off as a trick of the light unless you saw it 3 patients in a row. Caleb tested visual acuity on Bernice and got a 28 result, which is what fighter pilots have. He tested the father and got 2010. He tested the Uncle Cordy and got 2012. Healing time. Cordy's hand wound from 3 days neglected should have needed a debridement and 10 days of antibiotics. It was already closing on its own when he came in. Caleb gave him a prophylactic course of doxycycline and watched the wound seal in 48 hours, leaving no scar tissue. He logged the case as remarkable host immune response and moved on. This is the part where Caleb told me, "I want you to understand. I wasn't sitting there saying anything to myself about what these people were. I was sitting there going, this family has a heritable trait, some kind of genetic isolate. It happens in Appalachia. The hollers are full of founder effects. You get a small population, a few original settlers, generations of marrying inside the same 8 surnames, and you get conditions that don't exist anywhere else. There's a kind of muscular dystrophy that only exists in 2 counties in Tennessee. There's a metabolic disorder that only exists in 1 Mennonite community in Pennsylvania. I was looking at something like that. I was looking at a founder effect that had concentrated some unusual traits in one bloodline. That was my working theory. It was the only theory I had room for at the time. But he wanted to know. So, he did the thing that turned out to be the wrong thing to do, in the sense that it set everything else in motion. He called a friend of his from UK who'd gone into research genetics. Her name is Phoebe Reisner. She runs a lab in Lexington that does whole genome sequencing for clinical referrals. He sent her, with Bernice's mother's signed consent, 3 milliliters of Bernice Begley's blood, and a brief clinical summary describing what he was seeing across the family. Phoebe got back to him in 11 days. The conversation, according to Caleb, went like this. She said, "Caleb, where did this sample come from?" He said, "I told you, 14-year-old patient in Harlan County." She said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Phoebe, I drew it myself. What are you asking me?" She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "There's something in the 3rd chromosome that I cannot identify. It's a sequence insertion, about 1.2 megabases long. It's not in any reference database I have access to. It's not in any annotated human genome. It's not in any of the archaic hominin references either. I cross-checked Neanderthal, Denisovan, the Cima de los Huesos sample. It's not any of those. It's not in any non-human primate. It's not in any mammal. It's its own thing. And it's transcriptionally active. The boy is making proteins from it." Caleb didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked her if it could be contamination. Phoebe said no, she'd run it 3 times on different aliquots with different prep kits, in different rooms in the lab by different techs. Same result. The insertion was real. It was in the kid's germline. It had presumably come from his parents. She said, "I want to sequence more of these people. Can you get me samples from the rest of the family?" Caleb told her he'd see what he could do. Then he sat in his clinic in the dark after everyone else had gone home, and he tried to figure out what he was supposed to do with what she'd just told him. This is around where I want to slow down and tell you what kind of doctor he is, because his reaction to this information is not what you'd expect. He didn't get on a plane to NIH. He didn't write it up for a journal. He didn't call a press conference. He sat there for about 3 hours, and then he closed up the clinic and drove home. And he didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, he went back to seeing patients. And he didn't say a word about it for almost a month. He told me, "I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't because I had some grand theory yet. It was because I knew the Begleys. I'd been treating them for 14 years. I'd delivered 2 of Bernice's cousins. I'd sat at Wendell's kitchen table, eating cornbread, while he told me about his father working the number 31 mine in the 30s. They were my patients. They were my neighbors. Phoebe was a friend and a scientist and a good one. But she was in Lexington, and whatever this was, it lived in my town. And I felt very strongly before I even understood what I was feeling that I had to figure out how to handle it on my end before I let anybody else into it. So he did his own work for a month. He went back through every Begley chart in his system. He cross-referenced cousins, in-laws, distant relatives. He noticed something he hadn't noticed before. The trait did not show up in every Begley. It showed up in a specific subset. The ones with the teeth, the eyes, the hemoglobin, the healing. They were a sublineage. They were a branch off the main family tree, and you could trace it backward. The Begleys had been in that holler since the 1790s. The original land grant was issued to a man named Obadiah Begley by the state of Virginia in 1794 for service in the Revolutionary War. Obadiah had come down the Wilderness Road from somewhere around Abingdon. There was no record of where he'd come from before that. He'd married a woman whose name the records had as just Merwin, no surname, no origin. Their first child, a son named Crow Begley, was born in 1796, and from Crow forward, every generation had thrown one or two children with the trait, and the rest were unaffected. The trait carried through the maternal line preferentially. It had concentrated in certain branches and disappeared in others. He spent the month doing the kind of medical archaeology you only get to do in a small practice where you have been the only doctor for 14 years. He pulled up the photograph he kept on file of every patient he had ever delivered because he kept those, for himself, in a binder at home. He sorted the Begley photos by branch. He could see it once he was looking. The carriers had a particular set to the eyes, even as infants, a particular tilt to the upper lip, a way of holding the head, even at 3 days old, that the unaffected branches did not share. He went back through his physical exam notes. He had logged, over the years, dozens of small observations he had never connected. A Begley uncle's resting heart rate at 48, which he had logged as athletic. A Begley aunt's bone density scan that had come back well into the range you only see in young men who lift heavy. A Begley boy's healing from an appendectomy that had taken 5 days when it should have taken 3 weeks. None of these on their own had meant anything. All of them together, with the photograph binder open on his kitchen table, and the genealogy he had been sketching on legal pads, started to draw a portrait of a body that ran a little hotter than other bodies, that carried a little more oxygen, that repaired itself a little faster, that saw a little further into the dark. He cross-checked against other Haller families for comparison. The Mullenses had their own genetic quirks, including a kind of color blindness that ran through the male line. The Cornetts had a low rate of cardiovascular disease that Caleb had always assumed was diet-related and that he was no longer sure about. The Stidhams, who had married into the Begleys twice in the 1880s, had 2 carriers in the current generation that Caleb identified retroactively, both women in their 40s, both of whom had what he had logged as unusually robust constitutions. He could see it. He could see the shape of a thing that had moved through 130 years of marriages and births and burials in a small valley in Harlan County, and that had passed through his clinic over and over again without his understanding what was passing through his clinic. Caleb mapped it out. By the end of the month, he had a working pedigree going back 7 generations, 61 identified carriers across roughly 2 centuries. He had the gene, sort of, because Phoebe had identified the insertion. He had the inheritance pattern. He had the phenotype. What he didn't have was any idea what the insertion was for, what it coded for, what it did. Because while the hemoglobin and the teeth and the eyes were all suggestive of something, they didn't add up to a coherent picture. They were like the visible portion of an iceberg. There was a shape underneath that he couldn't see. That changed on a Tuesday night in October of 2019. Caleb got a call at his house at 2:18 in the morning. He told me he remembers the time because he wrote it on a notepad before he picked up the phone, which was a habit he had with after-hours calls in case anything came of it. The voice on the line was a woman he recognized, Lynette Begley, Bernice's aunt, Cordy's wife. She said her sister-in-law, Maybeth, was about to deliver. Maybeth was 41, which was already past where Caleb wanted any of his patients delivering at home. And she'd had a partial abruption with her last pregnancy, which was the kind of history that should have had her in a hospital with an OB and an OR down the hall. Caleb asked Lynette why she wasn't calling 911. Lynette said the family had decided to do the birth at home. Caleb asked why. Lynette said, "Doc, you've been our doctor for 14 years. You're the only one we're calling. You can come or not." He came. The drive from his house to the Begley place is about 23 minutes if you're driving sensibly and 14 if you're not. He did it in 16. He told me he was thinking the whole way about what he was driving into, because he'd come to understand by then that the home birth wasn't really about the home. It was about who got to see the baby, and he was being trusted with that, and he didn't know what to do with that trust, except go. The Begley homestead is at the very head of the holler, past the last paved road, past the last power line, accessible only by a single track of crushed limestone that the family maintains themselves. The main house is a long 2-story log structure that Wendell Begley's grandfather built in 1903. There are smaller outbuildings around it, sheds, a smokehouse, a barn for the 2 horses they still keep, a pair of newer mobile homes off to the side for the younger generations. When Caleb pulled up at 2:34, every window in the main house was lit with kerosene, and the front porch was packed with men. He counted 9, all of them Begleys, all of them watching him get out of his truck. Wendell Begley was on the porch in a chair, wrapped in a blanket. He'd been getting frailer over the last year. Caleb had been treating him for a slow cardiomyopathy that was eventually going to take him. Wendell raised one hand off the arm of the chair when Caleb came up the steps. He didn't say anything. None of them did. Lynette opened the front door, and Caleb went inside. The room where Maybeth was laboring was the back bedroom on the first floor, which the family had set up for it days in advance with clean sheets and basins of boiled water and a stack of folded towels and a kerosene lamp turned up bright. Maybeth was on the bed. Her husband, a man named Reese Begley, was holding her hand. 2 older women, both of them I think aunts or great-aunts, were on the other side of the bed. The mood in the room was not panic. It was not the chaos a home birth usually has when things are going badly. It was something closer to the mood of a vigil. Caleb did his job. He examined Maybeth. The baby was crowning. She was about 8 centimeters and progressing fast. Heart tones on the fetal stethoscope were good. He set up his kit. He scrubbed in. The 2 older women watched him the whole time with what he later described to me as a kind of careful evaluation. The way you watch a stranger handle something fragile that belongs to you. The baby came at 3:51 in the morning. A girl, 6 pounds, 2 ounces, pink, screaming, alive. APGAR of 9 at 1 minute, 9 at 5. By every metric, a healthy newborn. Except for one thing. Caleb saw it as he was clamping the cord. The infant's eyes were open, which is not unusual. Newborns open their eyes. What was unusual was that the irises were already pigmented, which they're not supposed to be. Pigmentation in human infants takes weeks to months to develop. This baby was looking up at him with eyes that were fully colored at the moment of birth. And the color was that pale amber yellow he'd seen in every adult carrier in the family, with that same vertical compression to the pupil that you'd swear was a shadow until the second one did exactly the same thing. He told me he kept his face neutral. He wrapped the baby and handed her to Maybeth. He cleaned up. He documented everything in his portable chart. He gave Maybeth the postpartum instructions she'd heard 4 times before. He packed his kit. On his way out, one of the older women stopped him in the hall. She put her hand on his arm. She was probably 80. Her hand was cold. She said, very quietly, so the others wouldn't hear, "Wendell wants to talk to you, not now. Come back Sunday at noon. Come by yourself." Caleb said, "Okay." He went out to the porch. Wendell was asleep in his chair, or appeared to be. The other men had thinned out. He drove home and got to his house at 4:47 and didn't sleep at all. He went back on Sunday at noon. This is the part where I keep coming back, because of what Wendell told him. And I want to give it to you the way Caleb gave it to me, which was slow, and with a lot of pauses, and with a sense that he wasn't entirely sure how much of it he believed, even after all the years he'd spent since. I'm going to pause here for now. I need to gather myself for the next part because the next part is where the rails come off the rest of this. Just understand the shape of what I've told you so far. A doctor in a small Kentucky coal town treating an extended family for almost 2 decades. A child's blood panel that didn't make sense. A genetics lab in Lexington finding a chunk of DNA in that child that doesn't appear anywhere else in the natural world. A newborn delivered in a back bedroom by kerosene lamp, who came out looking at the room with eyes that shouldn't have been pigmented yet. And a 91-year-old man on a porch in a blanket who wanted a private conversation about it. That was October of 2019. What I'm about to tell you happened over the next 4 years, and it ended with Caleb Sloan shutting down his clinic, signing his house over to his oldest patient as a parting gift, and driving east toward a coast he'd never lived near where he is now, and where I hope he stays, because the alternative is what we're about to get into. So, Sunday at noon. The drive up the holler that second time was different from the first one, Caleb told me, because he knew where he was going, and he knew, more or less, what he was being asked to come for. He just didn't know yet what shape the conversation would take. He brought nothing, no kit, no chart, no notebook. He'd left his phone in the truck at the bottom of the gravel road, because there was no signal up there anyway, and he didn't want it on him. Wendell met him on the porch. The blanket was gone. He looked stronger than he had on the night of the birth. the way some of the very old do when they've decided they have one important thing to do before they finish. He took Caleb inside, through the main room with the wood stove, down the hall, into a smaller room at the back of the house that Caleb hadn't been in before. The room was lined floor to ceiling on 2 walls with shelves, and the shelves were full of paper, bound ledgers, loose-leaf folders, what looked like older journals in leather cases, a few glass-fronted cabinets holding documents too old to be handled, a single oil lamp on a desk in the middle of the room, 1 chair on each side of the desk. Wendell sat down. He motioned Caleb to the other chair. He pulled a folder out from under the desk and put it between them. Then he said, "I figure you've already worked out most of it, so I'm not going to insult you by starting from the front. I'm going to start from where you are and fill in the rest." Caleb said. "Okay." Wendell said, "What did the woman in Lexington find?" Caleb didn't bother asking how Wendell knew about Phoebe. He just told him. He said an insertion in the 3rd chromosome, about 1.2 megabases, transcriptionally active, not matching anything in any known database, human or otherwise. Wendell nodded. He said, "That sounds about right. The boys in California found it in the 80s when they were doing the first sequencing work. They didn't have the database part of it yet, but they had enough to know it was foreign. They paid us to keep quiet about it. I have the paperwork." Caleb said, "Wendell, who is they?" Wendell didn't answer that. He opened the folder and slid the top document across the desk. It was a non-disclosure agreement on Department of Defense letterhead, dated 1986, signed by a man named Crow Begley, who was Wendell's father. The dollar figure on the second page was $400,000, which in 1986 was a lot of money to send to a coal country family. The terms required the family to permit periodic blood draws and biopsy samples in exchange for not being studied, observed, or contacted otherwise. It was the strangest research agreement Caleb had ever seen. It was an agreement to leave them alone in exchange for a small ongoing tribute of tissue. Wendell let him read it. Then he said, "That's how my father handled it. He was a practical man. He took their money. He sent them a tube of blood twice a year. They stopped asking around 2002. I don't know why. Maybe whoever was running it retired and the file got lost. Maybe they got what they needed. Either way, we haven't heard from them in 20 years. But the point is, this isn't new. Other people have found out before. The family has dealt with it before. You're not the first." Caleb said, "What is it, Wendell? What are you? What is the baby?" Wendell looked at him for a long time. Caleb told me the look was not unkind. It was the look of a man trying to decide how much of a long story to give a friend who had earned possibly a piece of it. Wendell said, "Have you read the Book of Enoch?" Caleb said no. He knew it existed. He knew it was an ancient Jewish text, that it wasn't in most Christian Bibles, that it dealt with angels in some way. He didn't know more than that. Wendell pulled a second document out of the folder. This one was a small black hardback, very worn, with the title stamped in gold on the spine. The Book of Enoch, translated by R.H. Charles, 1917, Oxford. Wendell slid it across. He said, "Read chapters 6 through 16 tonight, then come back and we'll talk about the rest. I'm not going to lead you. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. You read it, and you'll see what you see, and then we'll have the rest of the conversation." Caleb took the book. He drove home. He read all night. I'm going to tell you what's in those chapters because most of you have not read the Book of Enoch, and you need to understand what Caleb was looking at when he closed the book at 5 in the morning and sat at his kitchen table with the gray dawn coming up over the ridge. The Book of Enoch is one of the oldest religious texts in the world. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date the Aramaic original to at least the 3rd century BC, with parts probably older. It was preserved in full in only one place, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which still includes it in their biblical canon. R.H. Charles translated it into English from the Ethiopian Ge'ez text in 1917, and his translation is the one most scholars still use. Chapters 6 through 16 deal with a story called the Watcher Narrative. 200 angels, called the Watchers, descended to earth in the days of a man named Jared, who is the great-great-grandfather of Noah in Genesis. They came down on the summit of a mountain called Hermon, which is on the modern border of Lebanon and Syria. Their leader was named Semyaza. They had been sent to watch over humanity, and instead they fell in love with human women and decided to take them as wives. What follows is the part that matters for what Caleb was reading. The Watchers taught humanity things they weren't supposed to know. Azazel, one of the leaders, taught the making of weapons and the use of cosmetics. Another taught astrology. Another taught sorcery. Another the cutting of roots. Another the reading of the stars. The text is very specific about each one. And from their unions with human women, a generation of beings was born. The text calls them the Nephilim. Giants. The translation Charles used describes them as 3,000 ells tall, which is a figure that has been disputed since the text was first studied, with most scholars now thinking the original was probably 300 cubits, which is still about 450 feet. The number is symbolic. What matters is that they were not human. They were hybrids, and they ate everything humanity could produce, and when there was nothing left, they turned on humanity itself. Then comes the part that I think hit Caleb hardest. Chapter 15. After the flood destroyed the Nephilim's physical bodies, their spirits did not go to the underworld the way the human dead did. They were caught between, because they were neither fully human nor fully angelic. The text says, and I want to quote this, because it's the part Caleb circled in his copy. The spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. The text says, these spirits would remain on the earth until the end of the world, that they would seek refuge, that they would seek bodies, that they would find places to settle. Caleb closed the book at 5 in the morning. He sat at his table. The thing he kept coming back to was not the giants. It was the line about the spirits seeking bodies and finding places to settle. He made coffee. He drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come up. He thought about what kind of man he was before the book, and what kind of man he was going to be after. He understood that the answer was already different, that something had been moved a few inches inside him during the night, and that the move was not going to undo itself. He had a patient at 9, a 60-year-old miner with a back that was going. He went to the bathroom and shaved. He put on a clean shirt. He drove to the clinic and saw the patient at 9 and 4 more patients after that. And at noon, he closed the door of his office and called the Begleys and told Wendell he was coming back up the holler that afternoon. He drove back up to Wendell's that afternoon. This is where I want to be careful about what I'm telling you, because what Wendell said next, I am telling you secondhand from Caleb, who heard it firsthand from a man whose family has been keeping their own oral history for over 200 years. I cannot verify it. Caleb couldn't verify it. The family believes it. That's all I can offer. Wendell told him the story this way. He said the family had always known that they were not entirely from where everyone else was from. The original ancestor, Obadiah Begley, the one who'd come down the Wilderness Road in 1794, had married a woman the records called Merwin. She was not a settler's daughter. She had come out of the deep mountains alone, with no surname and no people, and she had married into the Begley line, and her children had carried something forward that was hers and not Obadiah's. Wendell's grandfather had been told by his grandfather that Merwin's people had been in those mountains for as long as the mountains, and that they had come there from somewhere else, from across the water, generations before any European had ever crossed it. They had moved through the high places, the ridges, the deep timber, the caves. They had survived because they had stayed away from people. And when the Europeans had come, in the early 1700s, with their guns and their disease, Merwin's people had been reduced. The ones who survived had been the ones who could pass for human enough to marry in. Merwin had been one of those. Wendell said, I don't know if I believe the back end of that story. I don't know if my great-great-grandfather believed it, but I know what the front end of it is. I know what we are when we shed it down. I know what my daughter's daughter's daughter is going to be when she's old enough for it to come on her. And I know the family has been holding it together for 9 generations, without anyone outside knowing, and I am going to keep it that way for the rest of my time, which is not long. And I am asking you because you have been a good doctor to my people, and because you have figured most of it out already, to help us keep it that way after I am gone. Caleb said, What does that mean? Help you keep it that way. Wendell said, You stop sending blood to your friend in Lexington. You let the carriers come and go from your clinic without writing anything down that anyone else can find. You sign the baby's birth certificates as healthy newborns, and you do not mention the eyes, and you do not mention anything that comes up later. And when somebody from outside starts asking, you tell us, and you tell them whatever you have to tell them to make them go away. Caleb said, And in return. Wendell almost smiled. He said, In return, nothing happens to you. In return, you go on being our doctor. In return, when the rest of this town is finished, which is going to be inside your lifetime, and the mines are gone, and the people are gone, and there's nothing left but us in the woods, we will see to it that you have a place to stay if you want one, and we will see to it that you are not alone. Caleb sat there for a while. He told me the room was very quiet. He could hear the wood stove ticking in the next room. He could hear birds outside the window. He could hear Wendell's slow breath. He could hear his own pulse in his ears. He said, "I want to see it before I agree. I want to see what I'm agreeing to." Wendell nodded like he'd expected that. He said, "Come back next Friday at sundown. I'll have Reese show you." Caleb came back next Friday at sundown. I want to be clear about one thing before I tell you what he saw, because I want you to take Caleb at his word, and I think you need to know the kind of person he is to do that. He is not a believer in the sense of having a strong religious commitment. He grew up Methodist, lapsed in college, never went back, has nothing against church but doesn't go. He is not a believer in anything paranormal. He doesn't read about ghosts. He doesn't watch the shows. When his wife had told him in 2008 that her mother's house in Hinman was haunted, he had been gentle, but he had not believed her, and they had argued about it. He is, in every recognizable way, a man whose feet are on the ground. So, when I tell you what he saw on that Friday at sundown, I am telling you what a man like that saw and reported, and you can take it for what it's worth. Reese Begley met him at the front porch. Reese is the father of the newborn girl from the home birth. He is 38 years old, lean, tall, the kind of man who looks like he was put together for a specific purpose and never quite told what it was. He led Caleb past the house, past the smokehouse, past the barn, up a footpath that went into the woods behind the homestead, and climbed for about a quarter mile to a small clearing on the side of the ridge. There was a fire pit in the middle of the clearing. There was a chair next to the fire pit. There was nothing else. Reese said, "Sit there, don't get up. Don't say anything, don't run. If you run, I can't promise what happens. If you sit, nothing happens to you." Caleb sat. Reese walked into the woods on the far side of the clearing. Caleb could see him moving through the trees for maybe 30 seconds. Then he couldn't see him anymore. The light was the color of a bruise. The sun was below the ridge, but the sky was still bright. Caleb waited. He told me he doesn't know how long he waited. He thinks it was about 15 minutes, but it might have been an hour. Time got strange. He could hear his own heartbeat very clearly. He could hear the woods, the small noises a forest makes at dusk in October, the settling of leaves, the movement of something small in the brush. Then those noises stopped, all of them, at once. The way they will when a hawk goes overhead, except a hawk passes in a few seconds, and the noises start back up, and these did not start back up. Then something came out of the trees on the far side of the clearing. Caleb's first impression, he told me, was that it was the wrong height. He couldn't get the proportions to make sense in his head. It was tall. He guessed 7 feet, but he wasn't sure, because the way it stood was not exactly upright. It was leaning forward, the way Reese had been leaning when he walked into the woods, except more so. Its front limbs hung down past where its knees would have been if it had knees in the human places. Its head was long, not pointed exactly, more like the head of a large dog, but with a higher forehead, a steeper rise to the cranium, eyes set forward the way a predator's eyes sit. The body was covered in hair, but the hair wasn't uniform. There were patches that looked like exposed skin, gray and lined, around the joints. The smell came across the clearing a second later, and it was not the smell of an animal. It was the smell of a man who had been working in the heat and hadn't bathed, with something underneath it that was musky and meaty and warm. It stood at the edge of the clearing. It looked at Caleb. The eyes were the Begley eyes. Caleb said this very clearly when he was telling me. The eyes were Reese's eyes. The vertical pupil was now extremely pronounced, almost a slit. But the color was the same, and the intelligence was the same, and there was no question in his mind, looking at it, that he was looking at Reese Begley. He told me he had not, until that moment, understood what people meant when they talked about religious experiences. He had read about them. He had patients who claimed them. He had always considered the category as something a brain produced when it had been deprived of sleep or food or normal stimulation, or when it was sick in particular ways. He thought of it as something explicable, even if the people having the experience were not in a position to explain it. Sitting in the chair in the clearing, looking at the thing that was Reese Begley, and was also not Reese Begley, he understood that he had been wrong about the category. There was a kind of experience the brain could have where the question of what was happening to it became unimportant compared to the question of how to be in the presence of what was happening to it. He had never had to be in the presence of anything before. He had treated patients and made diagnoses and signed death certificates and held the hands of widows, and none of that had been being in the presence of anything. This was being in the presence of a thing that was looking back at him and weighing him, in the same way a person weighs another person, but with a deeper and older set of scales. The thing he kept noticing was that it was breathing, not panting, not laboring. Breathing the way a man breathes who has just walked up a steep hill and is recovering. The chest rose and fell at a rate slower than a person at rest, deeper than a person at exertion. The breath came out in a faint cloud in the October cold and dissipated and came again. He could smell it on each exhale, the warm meat and the underneath of something he could not name. He counted the breaths without meaning to. 7 of them. Then he lost count because the thing's head moved, just slightly, the angle changing in a way that suggested it had finished some internal process. The decision had been reached. The recognition had landed. Caleb understood, without the thing doing anything to communicate it, that he had been accepted. It did not approach. It stood there for what Caleb estimated was 3 minutes. It made one sound, low in the chest, a vocal sound that was not a growl, was not a word, was something in between, a kind of acknowledgement. Caleb did not move. He told me he wanted to move, the way you want to move when you are about to fall off something high, the body wanting to do anything other than sit still. But he did not move. He understood that the deal he had been offered required him to sit still, so he sat still. Then it turned and went back into the woods. Caleb heard it moving through the brush for a few seconds, and then those noises faded, and a few minutes after that, the regular noises of the forest started back up. The birds, the leaves, the movement of small things. 20 minutes later, Reese came back out of the woods on foot, fully dressed, fully human, breathing a little hard. He looked at Caleb. He said, "You okay, Doc?" Caleb nodded. He couldn't make his throat work yet. Reese said, "I'm sorry about the smell. I know it carries." They walked back down to the house in silence. Wendell was on the porch when they got there. He looked at Caleb. He said, "Do you understand now?" Caleb said, "I think so." Wendell said, "Are you in?" Caleb said, "I'm in." That was October of 2019. The next 4 years, Caleb told me, were the most ordinary years of his medical career, in the sense that nothing visible changed and he went on doing the work the way he had always done it. He saw patients, he delivered babies, he set bones, he sewed up miners, and he carried inside him the thing he had agreed to carry, which was the knowledge that one of the families he was treating was something other than the rest of his patients, and that his job was to be the seal that kept that knowledge inside the hauler. He stopped sending samples to Phoebe. He told her he'd been wrong about the family, that the elevated hemoglobins were a benign founder effect, probably caused by something dietary, that he was sorry to have wasted her time. She didn't believe him. He could hear it in her voice. But she let it go because she was a good friend and she trusted him, and she had other things to work on. The 1.2 megabase insertion went into a file in her lab, anonymized, labeled as a sample of unknown provenance. As far as Caleb knew, it's still there, sitting in cold storage, waiting for someone in another decade to pull it out and not be able to identify it either. He started carrying the Begleys' medical records on paper. He'd write them up by hand in a separate set of charts that he kept in a locked drawer in his house. The electronic records said what they needed to say to satisfy the insurance company and to be useful to any covering provider. They did not say anything that an outside reader could string into a pattern. Birth certificates, the same. The newborn Begley girl, named Senna, born October 2019, was registered as a healthy infant with no remarkable findings. Caleb has signed off on 3 more Begley births since then. Same pattern, same notes, same eyes at birth. The harder part, he told me, was the patients themselves, because once you know what someone is, you cannot unknow it. He would be doing a physical on Cordy Begley, the uncle with the fast-healing hand, and he would be aware of every shift in the man's posture, the way his shoulders sat, the way his canines came together when he closed his mouth. He would be aware that he was treating a person who was, for parts of his life, not a person in the conventional sense. And Cordy would be aware in turn that Caleb knew, and that awareness would sit between them in the exam room like a third presence, and the visit would proceed normally, and the bill would be sent, and life would go on. He learned things slowly, over the 4 years, about the timing of it, when it happens. How often. Most carriers, he understood, don't shift on any regular schedule. It comes on them in periods of stress or solitude, or what Wendell called the right phase of the year, which Caleb came to understand was roughly the late autumn through early spring, when the cold made the metabolism right for it. Most adults shifted maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Some of the younger ones, the ones whose bodies hadn't settled into the rhythm yet, more often. There was a teenage girl in one of the cousin branches who Caleb had treated for what looked like seizures, and which her family understood as her body trying to shift before it knew how. He'd put her on a low dose of lamotrigine, which seemed to ease it for her, and her grandmother had brought him a jar of honey every month for the rest of that year as a thank you. There was an older man too, a Begley by marriage named Zell, who had taken his wife's family name when he came into the holler in the 1970s, who had come to Caleb in the spring of 2022 with what looked like a serious vascular event. He had been splitting wood in his yard and had collapsed. His son had brought him in. Ezel was 71. His blood pressure on intake was 220/130. His pulse was 178. His eyes were not the Begley eyes, because he was not a carrier himself, but he had spent 50 years married to one, and Caleb had been treating him for a long time, and he saw immediately that this was not a stroke. This was something else. Ezel's wife arrived 10 minutes after the son. She took one look at him on the exam table and asked Caleb to step outside. In the hallway, in a low voice, she told him that Ezel had been with one of the carriers a few hours earlier, helping with something the family didn't talk about in front of outsiders. She didn't say what. She didn't have to. She said it had been too long since the last time Ezel had been around it, and his body was reacting to the proximity in a way that her body did not. She said it sometimes happened with the spouses. She asked Caleb if there was anything he could do to bring the pressure down, without anyone asking questions about why the pressure had gone up. He gave Ezel a beta blocker by injection and watched the numbers come back to almost normal over the next 40 minutes. He logged the visit as a hypertensive episode of unclear etiology. Ezel went home that night and slept for 14 hours and was back to himself by morning. Caleb thought about that case for weeks afterward. He thought about what it meant that the bodies of the people around the carriers, the husbands and wives, and the very close friends also reacted, at the cellular level, to whatever the carriers were when they were not in their human form. It was as if the trait did not stop at the skin of the person who carried it. It cast a kind of field. It pulled on the people in proximity to it, the way a heavy object pulls on the space around it. He never wrote that down anywhere. He just sat with it, the way he sat with most of what he learned about the family, quietly, on his own time, in the back of his head. The places they went when they shifted, the high ridges, the deep cuts of timber back in the Cumberland that nobody hiked because nobody hiked back there anyway. The old strip mine reclamations where the trees had grown back wrong and crooked. There is a stretch of land on the backside of Black Mountain, accessible only by a logging cut that hasn't been maintained since the 70s, where the soil has a strange reddish cast to it, and where the underbrush grows thick and tangled in a way that doesn't match the rest of the forest. Caleb went up there once on a Saturday in the summer of 2021 because Cordy had told him about it and he had wanted to see it. The thing he noticed first was that there were no birds. He stood in that clearing for almost an hour and he did not hear a single bird call. The second thing he noticed was the bones, not piles of them, just the occasional rib or jaw or vertebra, half buried in the leaf litter, picked clean a long time ago. Deer mostly. A few elk. One that he was pretty sure was a black bear skull, the upper canine still seated in the bone. He didn't pick anything up. He didn't take pictures. He stood there long enough to understand that this was a place that was used, that had been used for a very long time, and then he walked back to his truck and he drove home and he didn't tell anyone he'd been there, not even the family. The Begleys had been moving through that landscape in that form for 9 generations. The carvings on the trees Caleb had occasionally noticed on house calls, the deep parallel grooves 7 or 8 feet up the trunks that he had once written off as bear damage. Those were not bear damage. They were Begley markings, territory, identification, the way a family in another setting might carve initials on a porch beam. Other families in the holler knew, not all of them, but enough. The older ones, the families who'd been there as long as the Begleys, the Mullenses up the next holler over, the Cornets on the ridge above, a couple of the halls down toward Cumberland. They knew because their own grandparents had known. They didn't talk about it. They didn't share it. They just understood that the Begleys were the Begleys, and that the Begleys had their ways. The arrangement, in other words, was older than Caleb. It was older than the clinic. It was older than the town. He had been brought into a thing that had been functioning quietly for over 2 centuries, and his job was to be the next link in it, for as long as he was willing to be. The thing he wasn't ready for, he told me, was how much he came to love them. Not in any complicated way. In the way you come to love your patients when you have been treating them for a long time. He loved Wendell, who died in March of 2021 at 92 or 99, depending on which document you believed, and whose funeral was held in the front yard of the homestead, and at which Caleb stood next to the family and said nothing, because there was nothing he needed to say. He loved Cordy and Lynette, who had him over for dinner every couple of months and didn't make a thing of it. He loved Senna, the baby from the home birth, who grew into a quiet 4-year-old with her father's eyes, and who would come into the clinic for her well-child visits and look at him with that careful evaluating expression that Caleb had first seen on the older women in the back bedroom, and who would let him listen to her heart and feel her belly and look in her ears, and who would say at the end of every visit in a small, clear voice, "Thank you for taking care of me, Dr. Sloan." He told me, "I'm not going to pretend the arrangement is simple. I'm not going to pretend that what I'm describing is right by any standard you could apply from outside. I'm telling you, it was what was in front of me, and I made my choice, and I lived with it, and I would make the same choice again. There are people in that holler who are not what the rest of the country thinks of as people, and they did not ask to be what they are, and they have built lives anyway, and they have raised children, and they have fed each other through bad winters, and they have done what families do. I'm not going to sit here and judge them. I'm not going to sit here and say I should have called Phoebe back. The world that would have come for them is not a kind world. They know that. They have the paperwork from 1986 to prove it. They know what happens when somebody finds them. So they hide. And I helped them hide. That's what I did. Okay, so that was the 4 quiet years. That was the steady state. And the steady state would have continued, in Caleb's account, indefinitely, if not for what happened in August of 2023. What happened in the August of 2023 was that a man came up the holler asking questions, and the man was not from any agency Caleb had ever heard of, and he was not someone the family could buy off the way they had bought off the Department of Defense in 1986, and he had a kind of focus to him that Caleb recognized immediately because he had seen the same focus before, in academic researchers who were very close to a breakthrough and who would not be stopped by anything as small as a closed door. The man's name was Dr. Alexander Vigne. He was 41, a researcher in human population genetics, originally out of the University of Oslo, currently doing what he described as a Wenner-Gren-funded survey of remnant European haplotypes in Appalachian founder populations. He had a laptop, a list of family names he was trying to get blood samples from, the relevant IRB paperwork from a research institution Caleb had never heard of, and the kind of bright, energetic manner that people in academia have when they have not yet figured out that they have walked into something they do not understand. He came to Caleb's clinic on a Wednesday afternoon. He explained his project. He'd been working his way through the Holler families. He'd already gotten samples from 4 households. He'd identified the Begleys as one of the founding families, and he wanted Caleb's help in approaching them because he understood that the family doctor was a trusted intermediary, and he wanted to be respectful of the community's autonomy. Caleb told him he'd talk to the family on his behalf. He told Vinjay it might take a few weeks. He told him to come back in mid-September. Then he drove up to the homestead, and he had what he later described as the worst conversation of his life with the family elders, which by 2023 was Reese and Cordy and a few of the older cousins, with Lynette presiding over the kitchen. He told them about Vinjay. He told them about the project. He told them about the 4 samples Vinjay had already taken from other families. Cordy wanted to know which families. Caleb told him. The cousins exchanged a look. Lynette said, "Those families don't have anything in them that would catch his attention. He'll come up dry on all 4 of those." Reese said, "And then he'll come for us." Caleb said, "Yes." The conversation went on for a while. The family considered options. Some of the options were ones that I am not going to repeat here, because the family did not in the end pursue them, and I don't want to suggest that they did. The option they settled on was the option that left no one harmed. They would do nothing. They would let Caleb handle Vinjay. They would trust him to send Vinjay away. Caleb thought about that for a week. He thought about it while he was seeing patients. He thought about it while he was driving home. He thought about it while he was lying awake at 4 in the morning. And the conclusion he came to was that he could probably stall Vinye for a season or a year, but he could not stall him indefinitely because Vinye was not the kind of researcher who would give up. Vinye was going to come back eventually, and the next time Vinye came, he might bring a colleague, and the colleague might bring a graduate student. And at some point, the project would draw the attention of somebody who would notice what Phoebe had noticed in 2019, and that would be the end of the arrangement that had held for 9 generations. So Caleb did something that he told me he is still working out the morality of, and that I am not going to defend or condemn because it is not my place. He called Vinye up. He told him that he'd talk to the Begleys, and that the family was willing to participate, but only under specific conditions. The conditions were that the samples be taken in a particular location that the family considered private, that they be taken at a particular time, and that Caleb himself be present. Vinye agreed. He was happy to accommodate. He was, by Caleb's reading, almost euphoric to have gotten that level of access. They drove up the holler on a Saturday in mid-September at 5 in the afternoon. Caleb led Vinye on the footpath up to the clearing on the side of the ridge, the same clearing where Caleb had sat in the chair 4 years earlier. Reese was waiting in the clearing. Reese was alone. The chair had been moved. There was no fire pit anymore. The clearing had been allowed to grow up a little, but it was still recognizable as a place where something happened. Vinye was excited. He set up his collection kit on a small folding table he'd brought. He explained the procedure to Reese, very politely in his accented English. Reese listened. Reese signed the consent form. Vinye drew 3 milliliters of blood from Reese's left antecubital vein with a butterfly needle and a vacutainer tube. He labeled the tube. He thanked Reese. He put the tube in his cooler. Caleb said, "Alexander, before we go back down, I need to show you something. There's a tree on the far side of the clearing that has markings on it that I think you should see. The family says they're from the original settlers." Vinye was happy to follow. He left the cooler with the sample on the table. He walked across the clearing with Caleb. They got to the tree line on the far side. Reese picked up the cooler. He walked into the woods on the path back toward the homestead. By the time Vinye and Caleb turned around, the cooler was gone. Vinye said, "Where is he going?" Caleb said, "He took your sample. I'm sorry." Vinye stared at him. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Dr. Sloan, what is this?" Caleb told him the truth, and the only version of the truth he was willing to give. He told Vinye that the family had agreed to the appointment in good faith, but that on reflection they had decided they were not comfortable with their genetic material leaving the holler. He told Vinye that he, Caleb, had supported the family's decision. He told Vinye that he was sorry for wasting his afternoon. He offered to drive him back to his hotel in Harlan. Vinye was angry. He was, Caleb told me, an academic, and academics have a particular kind of anger that comes out as cold rather than hot. He said a number of things to Caleb about research ethics, about the integrity of consent, about the obligations of a physician. Caleb let him say all of them. He did not argue. The drive was the worst 40 minutes Caleb had spent in his truck since the night of the home birth. Vinye sat in the passenger seat and did not look at him. They came down the gravel road and onto the paved road and through Lynch and past Cumberland, and Vinye made his case, methodically, the way a man does when he is angry, but trained to argue rather than fight. He talked about the years it had taken him to design the protocol. He talked about the funding committee in Stockholm that would have to be told that a key sample had been compromised. He talked about the Begleys as a population, as if Caleb did not know them, as if Caleb were a barrier between Vinye and a piece of data that belonged to science. Caleb let him talk. He noticed as Vinye talked that there was a part of him that wanted to explain, to put a hand on Vinye's arm and say, "You do not know what you are asking for. You think you are doing population genetics. You are not. You are wandering into something that has rules you have not been told about, and that will respond to you in ways you cannot predict." He did not say any of that. He kept his hands on the wheel. He watched the road. He thought about how he was going to explain to himself, later, that he had let Vinye go away, believing that this had been about something as small as a research dispute. He thought about whether that was a kindness or a cruelty. He decided he did not know. They pulled into the parking lot of the Hampton Inn in Harlan a little before 8 at night. The light was the long blue light of a September evening in the mountains. Vinye did not get out of the truck right away. He sat there for a moment with his bag on his lap. Then he said, in a voice that was no longer angry, just tired, "I have been in this work for 15 years, Dr. Sloan. I do not believe you. I believe you are protecting something. I want you to know that I will think about this for a long time. I will not stop thinking about it." Caleb nodded. He did not say anything. Vinjay got out. He shook Vinya's hand at the lobby door. He said, "I hope you understand." Vinjay said, "I do not understand. I will be filing a complaint." Caleb said, "I understand." Vinjay did file a complaint. It went to the Kentucky Board of Medical Licensure. The complaint described Caleb as having interfered with a research protocol and as having facilitated the destruction of a biological sample. It did not, of course, describe the underlying reason for any of it, because Vinjay did not know the underlying reason. The board reviewed the complaint and found no basis for action, because no specific harm to any patient had been alleged, and because the sample in question had been given voluntarily and could be withdrawn voluntarily under the consent form Vinjay himself had drafted. The complaint was dismissed in March of 2024. By March of 2024, however, Caleb had already decided to leave. He told me the deciding factor was not Vinjay. The deciding factor was the realization that he had now seen, up close, how a researcher coming after the family would look. And Vinjay was the first one, and Vinjay would not be the last one, and the next one might be smarter, and the one after that might be smarter still. The arrangement that had held for 9 generations was holding, just barely. But the world outside the holler was getting better at finding things. Whole genome sequencing was getting cheaper. Population studies were getting more comprehensive. Sooner or later, somebody was going to figure out what was in the Begleys, and when they did, the family would not be able to handle it the way they had handled it in 1986, because the people who came for them in 2030 or 2040 would not be researchers, and they would not be in suits with checkbooks. They would be something else. Caleb made his decision in the spring of 2024. He told the family. The family agreed it was time. Reese was, by then, effectively the head of the household. Reese said, "We'll find the next doctor. We've done it before." Caleb said, "I'll help." He started winding down. He sold most of his equipment. He arranged for a young doctor he knew from Pikeville, a woman who had grown up in the holler herself and who Caleb judged could be trusted, to take over the clinic. He didn't tell her about the Begleys. He told her instead that the Begleys were a family she should make a point of knowing, that they were good patients, that they were quiet about their business, that she should let them be quiet. He told her that Wendell had been her grandfather's friend, which was true, and that if she found Wendell's grandchildren coming to her with anything that struck her as unusual, she should write it down on paper and not on the computer, and she should mention it to no one. He told her this in a way that was vague enough to be ignorable if she didn't want to hear it, and specific enough to be remembered if she did. He thinks she heard it. He's not sure. He signed over his house to Wendell's youngest granddaughter, a woman named Tamra Begley, who was about to be married and who needed a home, because the Begleys had taken care of him for 19 years and he wanted to leave something behind. He packed his books. He packed his clothes. He packed Wendell's copy of R.H. Charles's translation of the Book of Enoch, which Wendell had given him to keep, and which is still on his shelf wherever he is now. He got in his truck. He drove east. He told me he drove without a destination for almost 3 weeks. He went to North Carolina first, then up through Virginia, then out to the coast. He found a small town. He didn't tell me which one. He has a small apartment. He is not practicing medicine anymore, at least not officially. He volunteers at a free clinic 2 days a week, doing what he calls light work, blood pressure checks, basic counseling, referrals to specialists. He says he doesn't think he'll deliver another baby. He says that's okay. I asked him, at the end of our last conversation, whether he was afraid for the family. He thought about it for a long time. He said, "Not for them, no. They've been handling themselves for 200 years. They'll keep handling themselves. I'm afraid for the people who go looking. I'm afraid for the next Alexander Vinjay. I'm afraid for the next genetics graduate student who decides that the holler families are an interesting research population. I'm afraid for them, because the family did not retaliate against Vinjay. The family let him go. The family is a family, but there are limits to what a family will tolerate, and I do not know where those limits are, and I do not want to be the doctor who is in the holler when somebody finds them." He said, "I think about Senna sometimes. She'd be 5 now. I think about whether the next doctor is going to recognize her eyes. I hope not. I hope she gets to grow up the way Wendell did, with the family around her, and a doctor who doesn't ask questions, and the woods to disappear into when she needs to. I hope she gets to be 91 on the porch of that house someday, with her own grandchildren around her, and one of them is having their first delivery, and the doctor that comes up the gravel road is a quiet woman who knows when not to write things down. That's the version where everybody wins. That's the version I work toward. He paused. He said, "But you should know." I think about the other version too. I think about somebody finding them, eventually, and the family deciding that the arrangement has broken. I think about what the family is when the arrangement breaks. I think about 9 generations of restraint, and what that restraint is restraining, and I think about it less than I used to, but I do think about it. I don't know how to wrap this up cleanly. Caleb didn't wrap it up cleanly. He told me his story, and then he said he had to go, and he hung up the phone, and I have not heard from him since. He is somewhere along the coast, in a small town, doing light work 2 days a week, with a copy of an old translation of an old book on a shelf in his apartment that nobody else who comes to visit him will ever notice or pick up. The Begleys are still up the holler past Lynch. The new doctor took over the clinic in the spring of 2024. As far as I have been able to confirm from public sources, she has reported nothing unusual. Senna Begley turned 5 years old in the fall. Her well-child visit was recorded as normal. If you find yourself, for some reason, ever driving up US 119 toward the eastern face of Black Mountain, and you turn off at Lynch and you take the gravel road up the holler past the last paved street, and you keep going until the road ends, and you see a long log house with a porch on it, and a barn behind it, and a few mobile homes off to the side. Do not stop. Do not ask questions. Do not pull out your phone to take a picture, because there's no signal up there anyway. But mostly because the family on that porch has been watching the road since before your great-grandfather was born, and they have a clear understanding of who belongs on it and who does not, and they will know, before you have come to a full stop, which one you are. If they wave you off, wave back, and turn the truck around, and go back down the way you came. The arrangement is still in place. The family is still holding the line they have been holding for 9 generations, in a small Kentucky coal town that almost nobody remembers, against a knowledge that most of the world is not ready for, and will not, in their lifetimes or yours, be ready for. The book on Caleb's shelf is still open to the same chapter it has been open to since he closed it that morning in 2019. The spirits in chapter 15 are still doing what the text says they do. They are still seeking refuge. They are still seeking bodies. They are still finding places to settle. They have settled. They have been settled for a very long time. You do not have to believe me. Caleb didn't ask me to make anyone believe him. He just asked me to tell it once, when he was far enough away that it couldn't reach back for him, and to tell it in a way that didn't draw a line back to the holler, and to be careful about which names I used. Which is why some of the names in what I just told you are not the names of the people Caleb was actually treating. Although the family is real, and the holler is real, and the doctor is real. That's the story. That's what I've got. Do with it what you want. Just understand that there are some hollers in this country that have been there longer than the country has, and that there are some families in those hollers that have been there longer than the families they look like, and that if you go looking for them, you might find them, and they might let you go. The way they let Alexander Vinje go, the way they have let almost everyone go who has come looking in 200 years. Or they might not. The arrangement is the arrangement until it isn't. And the only person I knew who understood the difference between the two was a country doctor named Caleb Sloan, and he is not in Kentucky anymore, and he is not coming back. That's all I have for you tonight. Sleep well, if you can.